Astronauts saw things they couldn't explain, glowing crafts, eerie whispers, something watching them. NASA denied. But this ancient image, what does it reveal? Have they been here all along? In June 1965, James McDivitt was piloting the Gemini 4 spacecraft, orbiting Earth at over 17,000 miles per hour. It was a mission focused on spacewalking and testing long-duration flight. But something else happened up there. Something he never forgot. During one of the orbits, McDivitt looked out the window and saw something strange. A bright object, metallic, cylindrical, floating outside. It had some kind of long arms or antennae sticking out. It wasn't space debris, it wasn't another satellite, and it was moving. He called over his fellow astronaut, Ed White, but before White could see it, the light changed, and the object was gone. They were alone again, or at least it seemed that way. McDivitt took photos. NASA got them. But when the images were released, they were blurry, unimpressive. The strange craft that McDivitt described wasn't in them, or maybe it was, buried somewhere in the film, altered, dismissed. NASA's explanation? Space debris, a reflection, a trick of the light. McDivitt never backed down from his sighting. He knew what he saw and he knew it wasn't normal. Years later he would say that it didn't look like anything he had ever seen before. And he was an Air Force test pilot. He had spent years in the skies training his eyes to recognize aircraft and celestial objects. This wasn't one of them. NASA moved on, never investigating further. The public moved on, distracted by bigger missions, bigger achievements. But the question lingers. If experienced astronauts can't explain what they saw, then who can? Some sightings happen in the blink of an eye. Others stretch into something more, something that lingers. Story Musgrave, a veteran astronaut with 6 space flights under his belt, didn't see a quick flash or a distant dot. He saw something moving, something alive. During one of his missions aboard the space shuttle, Musgrave reported seeing a long, white, snake-like object twisting and undulating in the vacuum of space. Not debris, not a piece of the shuttle breaking off. Something organic in its movement. It wasn't following a predictable path like a satellite or a spent rocket booster. It seemed to be swimming. Musgrave was no amateur. He was a scientist, a surgeon, a man trained to analyze and explain, but he never found a real answer. NASA chalked it up to ice particles, maybe a loose piece of insulation. But that explanation never fit quite right. Ice particles don't move like that. They don't coil and slither. And here's the eerie part. He wasn't the only one to see something like this. Other astronauts from both American and Russian space programs have spoken about strange, snake-like objects appearing outside their spacecraft. The kind of sighting that doesn't make it to the front pages. The kind of thing people dismiss because it shouldn't exist. But if it was just space debris, why did it move with intent? Why did it behave as if it was observing? If anyone else had said it, it might have been ignored, but this was a man who had spent nearly 1,300 hours in space. A man who knew the difference between floating junk and something else. And Musgrave's sighting was not the first time an astronaut reported something unusual moving alongside them. Years earlier, John Glenn had a different kind of encounter, one that NASA scrambled to explain. In 1962, John Glenn became the first American to orbit Earth. Alone in his tiny capsule, Friendship 7, he was focused, alert, completely immersed in the mission. Then, something unexpected happened. A glow. A swarm of tiny, shimmering lights surrounding his spacecraft. They flickered and pulsed, moving in ways that defied expectation. Hundreds of them, maybe more, drifting and dancing around the capsule. He called them fireflies. For minutes he watched them, confused but mesmerized. They didn't seem threatening. They didn't behave like ice particles, which would simply follow the motion of the spacecraft. They seemed independent, as if they had appeared for a reason. Glenn reported everything to Mission Control. On the ground, engineers scrambled for an answer. They needed an explanation, something ordinary, something technical. Later, NASA would say the fireflies were frozen condensation breaking away from the spacecraft. Tiny ice crystals reflecting sunlight, disturbed by Glenn's movements. A neat and tidy answer, maybe even a true one. But some weren't convinced, because Glenn wasn't the only astronaut to see them. Over the years, other space travelers described similar glowing, moving lights appearing outside their spacecraft. Each time, NASA gave the same answer, just ice, just reflections, just a trick of the light. But what if it wasn't? What if something was out there, watching? Something that appeared when it wanted to, choosing when to be seen. And as space missions continued, reports like Glenn's didn't stop. In fact, one of the most bizarre sightings came decades later, caught on camera during Space Shuttle mission STS-80, a sighting that NASA never quite explained. Space Shuttle missions were routine by the 1990s. Cameras captured everything, inside, outside, around the shuttle. Every movement, every anomaly was recorded. And in 1996, during mission STS-80, something appeared on camera that left experts and astronauts speechless. During the mission, astronauts on board the shuttle Columbia were filming Earth when strange circular objects appeared. These weren't specks of dust or camera glitches. They moved with purpose, entering the frame one by one, slowing down, changing direction. Then, in an eerie moment, they formed a loose formation, almost like they were aware of each other. The footage showed one object moving toward Earth's atmosphere, stopping suddenly, and hovering as if it was observing something below. Objects that behave like that don't exist in conventional spaceflight. Satellites don't stop mid-orbit. Space debris doesn't maneuver in unison. NASA never gave a clear answer. The official explanation suggested ice crystals, but the way these objects moved made that hard to believe. Ice crystals don't halt, change speed, and float in patterns. Whatever was in that footage wasn't behaving like debris. The video became one of the most compelling pieces of NASA-captured UFO evidence. Experts debated its meaning for years, but no one could provide an explanation that made sense. The STS-80 footage remains an unsettling glimpse into something unknown, something watching. And yet, STS-80 wasn't the only space shuttle mission where strange things were caught on camera. Just a year before, during STS-75, something even more bizarre happened. It started as a simple experiment. The crew of STS-75 deployed a long, thin tether into space, nearly 12 miles of conductive cable stretching out from the shuttle. It was meant to test electricity generation in orbit, but what happened next shocked everyone watching. The tether broke. Instead of functioning as planned, it drifted loose, floating away from the shuttle. NASA was disappointed, but the real story began when cameras zoomed in on the escaping tether. Dozens, maybe even hundreds of strange glowing objects began appearing around it, circular, pulsating, and massive compared to the tether itself. They drifted in, moving in ways that didn't match space debris. Some had holes in their centers like classic flying saucers. They didn't just pass by, they seemed drawn to the tether, clustering around it, almost inspecting it. Millions watched the footage live. When NASA realized what was being broadcasted, they quickly dismissed it. Ice particles, debris, out-of-focus camera distortions, anything but something unexplained. But the video showed otherwise. The objects were moving independently, shifting directions, acting as if they were under intelligent control. Debunkers tried to explain it away, but no explanation fully accounted for the sheer number of objects, their size, their synchronized movements. To this day, the STS-75 tether footage remains one of the most jaw-dropping UFO encounters ever captured in space. But unexplained encounters didn't start with shuttle missions. One of the earliest astronaut UFO sightings happened decades earlier, and it came from a man who had nothing to gain by lying. Gordon Cooper saw something up close, something that should have never been there. Gordon Cooper wasn't just any astronaut. He was one of NASA's first, the Mercury 7, America's space pioneers. He was a combat pilot, a man trusted with national secrets, someone who didn't deal in fantasy. When he said he saw a UFO, people listened. His first encounter happened years before he went to space. While stationed at Edwards Air Force Base in the 1950s, Cooper and his team witnessed a flying saucer land right in front of them. They filmed it, reported it, and handed the footage over to higher-ups. It was never seen again. But Cooper's most famous UFO story happened in orbit. During his Mercury Atlas 9 mission in 1963, something strange appeared outside his capsule. A glowing greenish object moving at incredible speeds. It wasn't a satellite, it wasn't space debris. Radar operators on the ground confirmed they were tracking it, meaning it wasn't just an optical illusion. Cooper radioed the sighting to NASA, but when he landed, something changed. Reporters weren't allowed to ask about it. Official transcripts omitted any mention of the UFO, and Cooper was told never to discuss it publicly. Years later, he broke his silence. He openly spoke about UFOs, about the things he saw, about the government's refusal to acknowledge the truth. He was convinced that extraterrestrial intelligence was real, that it had been here, that it had been watching. Leroy Chiao was no stranger to space. As commander of Expedition 10 aboard the International Space Station, he had spent months in orbit, staring out into the endless blackness, watching Earth drift below. But one day, something appeared that defied explanation. It happened during a spacewalk. Chow was outside the ISS, floating hundreds of miles above the planet, performing routine maintenance. His attention was focused, his mind locked on the task at hand. Then, out of nowhere, something caught his eye. A row of lights, bright, evenly spaced, moving in formation. Not a single object, but multiple, traveling together against the backdrop of Earth. They weren't following the usual paths of satellites. They weren't space debris tumbling in unpredictable motions. These lights moved with precision. Chow was stunned. He tried to make sense of what he was seeing. It was unlike anything he had encountered before. When he reported the sighting, explanations came fast. Fishing boats on Earth, city lights reflecting off the atmosphere. But something didn't sit right. The objects he saw weren't below him. They were out in space, moving independently. NASA didn't pursue it further. Like so many astronaut UFO sightings, it was brushed aside, rationalized, filed away. But Chow remained fascinated by what he had witnessed. He never claimed it was alien, but he never found a satisfying explanation either. It was another reminder that even in the most controlled, high-tech environments, things appear that can't be explained. And astronauts, trained to be the sharpest observers in human history, keep seeing them. Edgar Mitchell wasn't just another astronaut. He was a scientist, a decorated Navy officer, and one of only a handful of humans who had walked on the moon. But after his Apollo 14 mission, his focus shifted. Because Mitchell had learned something he couldn't ignore. He never personally saw a UFO in space, but what he did see was even more compelling. He met people deep inside military and intelligence circles who told him, off the record, that we were not alone. He claimed that extraterrestrials had been visiting Earth for a long time, that the government knew, and that the truth was being kept from the public. Mitchell wasn't just speculating. He spent years talking to high-level officials, including those who had worked at Roswell. He spoke with military officers who swore they had seen crashed crafts, dead extraterrestrial bodies, and technology so advanced it made modern aircraft look primitive. NASA distanced itself from Mitchell's claims, but that didn't stop him. He gave interviews, wrote books, and insisted that world governments had been suppressing knowledge of UFOs for decades. He even hinted that some astronauts had seen more than they were allowed to admit. And yet, Mitchell's words weren't completely unique. Across the world, in the heart of the Cold War, Soviet cosmonauts had been witnessing strange things of their own. But unlike in the West, their encounters were buried even deeper in secrecy. It wasn't just American astronauts who reported the unexplainable. Soviet cosmonauts had their own encounters that were just as baffling, just as mysterious, but even more heavily suppressed. One of the most famous cases came from Pavel Popovich, a highly respected Soviet cosmonaut. While flying a plane at high altitude in 1978, he and his crew saw a huge triangular craft following them. It wasn't a satellite, it wasn't a meteor, it moved with purpose. When he reported it, he was told to keep quiet. Then there was Vladimir Kovalyonok, a cosmonaut aboard the Salyut 6 space station in 1981. During his mission, he saw an object outside the station's window, a sphere, pulsating with energy, changing shapes as he watched. It was nothing like space debris. Before he could grab a camera, the object suddenly disappeared. Other Soviet cosmonauts hinted at strange encounters but were warned never to speak about them. The KGB had an entire department dedicated to UFO reports, but everything was locked away. Unlike in the US, where astronauts could at least hint at their experiences, in the Soviet Union, talking about UFOs could ruin a career. Or worse. For decades, these stories remained buried. It wasn't until the fall of the Soviet Union that some reports started leaking, showing that even in space, something was watching. And if astronauts and cosmonauts, some of the most highly trained and level-headed people on Earth, couldn't explain what they were seeing, then who could? Most people have never heard of Maurice Chatelain. He wasn't an astronaut, but he played a crucial role in early space missions. He was NASA's chief of communications during the Apollo program. A man with access to transmissions, signals, and classified conversations between astronauts and mission control. And what he later claimed shocked everyone who would listen. Chatelain stated that NASA had been aware of extraterrestrial activity in space for a long time. He claimed that every Apollo mission encountered UFOs at some point, but the information was buried, hidden behind classified documents and vague explanations. The real truth, he said, was that astronauts weren't alone out there. He even suggested that Apollo 11, the first mission to land on the moon, had seen something strange as soon as they arrived. The radio chatter was cut from public broadcasts, but according to Shuttle, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin reported visitors watching them from the rim of a crater. Large, glowing objects, just sitting there, observing. NASA dismissed Shuttle's claims, but he wasn't the only one hinting at strange encounters during Apollo 11. Buzz Aldrin himself would later speak about something unusual that followed them on the way to the moon. Buzz Aldrin was second only to Neil Armstrong in stepping onto the moon, but his most bizarre experience happened before they even landed. On their way to the lunar surface, Aldrin saw something strange outside the spacecraft, a shiny moving object, keeping pace with Apollo 11. At first he thought it might have been a spent rocket stage, drifting away from them. But when they contacted Mission Control, they were told the last known position of the rocket stage. It was over 6,000 miles away. Whatever was out there with them, it wasn't theirs. Aldrin and the crew debated whether to report it. Talking about UFOs wasn't exactly encouraged. They decided to mention it in vague terms, keeping it off official records. Years later, Aldrin would acknowledge the sighting publicly, stating that he wasn't sure what it was, only that it didn't belong to them. NASA's response? Reflections off the spacecraft windows. A common excuse one used time and time again when astronauts saw something that didn't fit the script. Apollo 11 made history, but their strange encounter on the way to the moon was never seriously investigated. And they weren't the only Apollo crew to experience something odd. Just 3 missions later, Apollo 14 had its own mysterious moment, one that happened over an open radio frequency. During the Apollo missions, astronauts had 2 types of communication: public transmissions, which the world could listen to, and private medical channels, reserved for conversations that weren't meant for the public ear. But during Apollo 14, something slipped through that wasn't supposed to be heard. A strange, whispered conversation between the crew surfaced, one discussing an unknown object they had spotted. The transmission was partially recorded before it was cut off. The words were brief but chilling. "We found the bogey, I still have it, yeah, it's looking at us." Then silence. The channel was switched. No further explanation was ever given. NASA never addressed it. The transcript remained buried for years. Officially, Apollo 14 had no encounters with unknown objects, but the transmission hinted at something else. Something seen, acknowledged, and then quickly hidden away. And the deeper one looks into Apollo-era records, the more strange moments like this begin to appear. Conversations cut off, unexplained lights, and accounts from astronauts who years later would admit that they had seen things they couldn't explain. Apollo 16 was meant to be a straightforward mission, another step in humanity's journey across the moon. But what astronauts captured on film during their time in orbit left behind one of the most debated pieces of Apollo footage ever recorded. While the Apollo 16 command module was circling the moon, a camera on board captured a mysterious object in space. It appeared to be a structured craft, metallic, reflecting sunlight. It hovered near the spacecraft, seemingly observing before slowly moving away. The footage showed an object that didn't match any known satellite, spacecraft, or natural lunar debris. NASA's explanation? They claimed it was the Apollo 16 lunar module's floodlight, a reflection of their own equipment. But many weren't convinced. The way the object moved, the way it held position and then slowly drifted away, didn't match a simple light reflection. Some researchers believe the footage shows an unknown craft, possibly something monitoring Apollo 16. The clip remained buried for years, only resurfacing when NASA released thousands of old Apollo tapes. To this day, no clear answer has been given. Was it just an optical illusion, or was Apollo 16 being watched? And if there was something out there, what did Apollo 11 see first? Because if Maurice Shuttle's claims were true, Neil Armstrong saw something even more disturbing. Officially, Neil Armstrong's first words from the moon were some of the most famous in history. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. But some believe another conversation took place. A private one. One that was never meant to reach the public. According to leaked reports and claims from intelligence insiders, Armstrong made an urgent, off-the-record transmission to NASA just after stepping onto the moon. In it, he described large objects watching them from the edge of a crater. The alleged transmission went something like this: "They're here. They're watching us. I tell you, there are other spacecraft here, lined up on the far side of the crater. They're watching us." NASA quickly cut the public feed, switching to a secret channel. Armstrong and Aldrin continued their mission, but according to some insiders, they were shaken. After their return, neither of them spoke about it publicly. NASA dismissed the claim as nothing more than conspiracy talk. No such transmission was ever confirmed, and Armstrong never publicly acknowledged it. But years later, other astronauts, including Edgar Mitchell, hinted that Apollo 11 had seen something unusual on the moon. If Armstrong really had a secret conversation that day, what was so important that it had to be hidden from the world? And why did NASA continue to deny astronaut encounters with unknown objects until whistleblowers started leaking footage? For decades, NASA kept tight control over the footage and communications from space missions. But no matter how hard they tried to contain the truth, some pieces slipped through. Former NASA contractors and employees have come forward over the years, claiming that certain videos were deliberately altered, hidden, or classified. One of the most well-known whistleblowers, Donna Hare, worked as a photo technician inside NASA. She claimed she saw doctored images, with strange objects edited out before public release. She wasn't alone. Another ex-NASA worker, Ken Johnston, alleged that Apollo astronauts had photographed strange objects on the moon, but were ordered to hand over all images, many of which were never seen again. Then there were the leaked live feeds, uncut transmissions from shuttle missions and the ISS, showing objects moving against all known physics before NASA abruptly cut the broadcast. Every time the response was the same: camera glitch, ice, reflections. But how many coincidences does it take before it stops being a coincidence? NASA whistleblowers insist that astronauts have encountered things they cannot explain, but that admitting to it could damage credibility, cause public panic, or worse, reveal that we are not alone. For decades, astronauts, our best trained eyes in space, have seen something watching, following, waiting. NASA denies, footage vanishes, voices are silenced, but the truth drifts just beyond reach, circling us in the dark. If they're out there, what do they want? That's about it. Do you believe in aliens? Let me know in the comments. For more useful information, watch other videos.